Welcome to The Debate. Today we're tackling, well, one of the most defining moments in all of sports history, the absolute sudden end of the Chicago Bulls dynasty. This was right after their sixth NBA championship in 8 seasons, that incredible 1997-98 season where they beat the Utah Jazz 4-2.
And that season is just frozen in time, isn't it? It's not just about the championship. Our source material universally cites it as the moment Michael Jordan retired for the second time, and that golden era just stopped. It ceased to exist.
Exactly. And so the central question we have to grapple with is, well, it's pretty complex because the end was just so abrupt. We need to figure out if the end of the Jordan-led Bulls in '98 was truly inevitable, a necessary conclusion born from, deep organizational exhaustion, or if it was a premature, avoidable ending that cut a dominant team off at the knees.
Going to be arguing that the evidence points overwhelmingly to an avoidable conclusion. The choice to dismantle that dynasty was, from my perspective, a managerial one, driven by internal politics, not by any real, measurable decline in performance.
I see why you'd think that, but let me offer a different perspective. I contend that the end was structurally necessary and, frankly, perfectly timed. Sustaining that level of success, 6 titles in 8 years, it had created dynamics inside the organization that made continuing basically impossible. So my core position is that this end was really predetermined by institutional reality, not by what was happening on the scoreboard. Yes, of course, they finished the season with 62 wins, tied for the best record in the league. But the source material confirms the definitive factor was Coach Phil Jackson's explicit decision not to return, which then became the catalyst for Jordan's retirement. The intellectual leadership was gone, the constant pressure, the friction, it had all just maxed out the team's capacity. Ending it all at the absolute peak with the title was the only clean way to preserve the legend.
See, I come at it from a different way. I just don't think you can separate the question of necessity from the actual athletic output on the court. The evidence suggests the Bulls were still operating at the absolute pinnacle of the league, which makes the end entirely avoidable from a competitive standpoint. The performance data just completely refutes this idea of a necessary decline. Not only did they tie for the best record, 62-20, but the individual dominance was just off the charts. Michael Jordan wasn't just the league MVP, he was a scoring leader, All-NBA first team, and this is crucial, All-Defensive first team. Dennis Rodman led the entire league in rebounding, and Scottie Pippen, even with his injuries that year, made All-NBA third team and All-Defensive first team. So you have a core trio, the best player, the best rebounder, and an elite defender all at an award-winning level at the same time. The decision to break up what was demonstrably the best team in the world was purely administrative, not athletic.
You highlight that 62-20 record as proof of strength, and yeah, those numbers are compelling. But let's dig into our first contention here. Interpreting that record not as a sign of mastery, but as evidence of structural strain that was masking a real vulnerability.
That's a compelling point, though I would frame it differently. A .756 winning percentage. How can you possibly see that as vulnerability? And if we look at the playoffs where the real strain is measured, they still got through it. The only real close call was the Eastern Conference Finals against the Pacers, which went 7 games. But the Bulls still won. Winning a 7-game war like that proves resilience, not exhaustion. If they were truly depleted, they lose that series. The fact that they closed it out just confirms the system was still robust.
I'm not so sure. I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because that 7-game series against Indiana is the precise evidence of the strain I'm talking about. They were pushed to the absolute limit. Yes, they won, but the margin for error had completely vanished compared to earlier title runs. 6 titles in 8 years. That puts an immense competitive tax on everyone. The sheer effort it took just to get those 62 wins and squeak by that series suggests they had maxed out their competitive cycle, at least with that specific aging group.
But those limits you're talking about, they're based on the conflict between the GM and the coach, a failure of management, not a failure of the athletes. We're arguing necessity. If the talent is still superior, and having Jordan and Pippen on the all-defensive first team is proof of that synergy, then why should the players be penalized for the general manager's operational failures?
And that leads us right into our second contention, the economic and organizational necessity, which was completely independent of player effort. You call it a failure of leadership, but I see it as the institutional impossibility of keeping that roster together under the coming economic reality.
That's an interesting angle, but what specific economic reality was so insurmountable that getting rid of the greatest dynasty in sports history was mandatory?
We have to look at the context of the looming lockout. Management knew a huge financial restructuring was coming. Key role players for the triangle offense, guys like Luke Longley, Steve Kerr, they were all free agents or near the end of their contracts. Retaining them, especially with Pippen's famously cheap contract finally expiring, would have meant astronomical salary cap figures. The management decision, which we know included Krause's mandate that Jackson would not be back, that was a preemptive break to manage the salary cap and avoid paying huge luxury taxes for a team that was only going to get older.
Okay, I appreciate the asset management argument, but that just reinforces my point. It was a choice driven by a financial calculation, not a competitive necessity. A team that delivers 62 wins in a championship led by the league MVP. That's a team worth paying a premium for. To say the end was necessary because of salary cap issues is to say financial prudence trumps guaranteed dominance. That's a business decision. It's not a competitive requirement. If they could win in '98, they were the favorite to win in '99.
But you can't just plug and play new guys into the triangle offense. The depth mattered immensely. Rodman, the league's top rebounder, was 37 years old. Ron Harper was 34. To keep that unique mix, Jackson would have needed a new multi-year deal, which Krause was famously unwilling to offer. The conflict wasn't just about personality. It was about totally different visions for how to manage an aging team. Krause's whole organizations win championships idea directly informed the choice to dismantle a high-cost, high-drama structure before it collapsed. That internal friction, it made continuation impossible.
That is a powerful argument about the organizational fracture. I'll grant you that. But let's step outside Chicago for our third contention. How did this supposedly aging, depleted team stack up against the emerging threats in the league?
Well, while the Bulls were elite in '98, the league was fundamentally shifting. You had two new, potent dynasties developing in the West. The San Antonio Spurs, with Rookie of the Year Tim Duncan, and the rising Lakers built around Shaq and a young Kobe Bryant. The Bulls relied so heavily on their perimeter defense, Pippen and Jordan and Rodman's unique rebounding. Maintaining dominance against the next wave of athletic big men and the evolving pace of the game would have required massive adjustments that I'm just not sure an aging, exhausted core was equipped to handle. The clock wasn't just ticking on their contracts, but on their strategic viability.
I have to respectfully disagree with that assessment. The Bulls had just proven they could suffocate the best of the West in the finals. Their defensive cohesion, again with two players on the all-defensive first team, suggests a system that is inherently adaptable. You mentioned the Spurs, but they were still developing. The Lakers were still immature. The Bulls had proven they were the best defensive team in the league right then. Why would you preemptively surrender just because younger teams might be better next year? The necessity has to be based on the reality of 1998, and that reality was dominance. And if the system was failing, why was Jordan putting up MVP numbers? His performance doesn't mask systemic failures. No, his performance refutes the idea of systemic decline. If you keep the greatest player ever, who is still demonstrably the most productive player in the league, the term necessary ending just feels wrong.
I think that premise relies too heavily on Jordan single-handedly holding off a structural collapse. His excellence was a result of maximizing the organizational structure around him. When the intellectual core, Jackson, leaves, and the organizational leadership, Krause, refuses to compromise, the structure collapses. The dynasty, as we knew it, had reached its natural limit.
And that limit was just an unwillingness to pay the price to maintain harmony and competitive advantage, not an athletic impossibility. We are talking about potential championships just left on the table because management prioritized cost over history. The fact that Jordan won the MVP, the scoring title, and the championship in the same season is the strongest counter-evidence you could possibly have to the claim of competitive necessity.
But that very peak achievement is what made the break inevitable. They had done everything. To try again would have been to risk a failure that might have cheapened the whole six-title run.
And that, I think, is the philosophical difference here. You're prioritizing the preservation of the narrative. I'm prioritizing the maximization of competitive potential. If the best player in the world is still at his peak, the obligation is to find a way forward, not to surrender.
So we've really explored the tension between what the undeniable stats suggest and the profound organizational pressures that define that era's end. I maintain that the 1998 end was the inevitable conclusion of a perfect, exhausting run. The internal friction, Jackson's unwillingness to continue under those terms, and the looming economics, it all confirms that ending on that high note was the necessary breakpoint.
And despite all that powerful evidence of organizational conflict, the performance metrics from that season, the MVP, the statistical leaders, the league best record, strongly suggest the Bulls were still the team to beat. Their success was based on peak athletic performance, which means the decision to end the dynasty was a managerial choice, pure and simple. It was about cost and control, not competitive decline.
A choice that preserved the historical meaning of the run perfectly.
But it certainly raises the question of how many more titles were sacrificed for the sake of a clean exit.
I think our discussion shows that to really understand the legacy of the '98 Bulls, you have to weigh both sides, the tangible, statistical evidence of their dominance against the documented organizational and economic constraints that fundamentally capped their competitive cycle. There is clearly more to explore in the material about the nature of these cycles and what truly makes an ending inevitable.